joining us here this afternoon. I'm Brian Rogers from Jankiel Santos Investment Bank here in New York. With me is our chief Brazilian economist, Jankiel Santos. We've just been on a roadshow throughout the United States, visited a bunch of investors in New York, Boston, West Coast. Now we're back here again today on a rainy Friday afternoon in New York. But we're very pleased to have Jankiel here with us today, and we want to jump right into some questions, to many of the questions that investors had for us during the roadshow. And with that, why don't we get started? Jankiel, investors very curious about what's going on in Brazil these days. The central bank's monetary policy has been a bit non-conventional, a bit unstandard for what you might expect. They've been cutting rates in an environment where inflation's been running at the higher end of the range. Can you give us a sense of how they're getting comfortable with that, or what they're trying to achieve through this policy?
I think that the central bank is counting on a contribution from the international jitters that should bring that were supposed to bring inflation down via the contributions of a deflationary impact in terms of the tradable items over there. The fact is that we are not seeing that. We are just seeing a disinflation taking place in the tradable items, and we are seeing that even this disinflation process has apparently come to an end, and therefore, given the perspective that we have for domestic demand and the stimuli that we have seen both from the fiscal side and the monetary side for the consumption, well, this inflation should not converge towards the target, and therefore the skepticism about the Brazilian central bank approach towards inflation and its conduct of the monetary policy. So that's pretty much what we have been seeing in Brazil, a tug of war between the Brazilian central bank and the Brazilian market participants, or the market participants in general.
And now one of the ways you're seeing this sort of struggle, tug of war as you put it, is in the reflection between what the central bank has done regarding rate cuts and what the market inflation expectations have been. Can you talk a little bit about that number, the way those two things have compared recently?
Yeah, I would say that the central bank in its forecasts have been pointing towards convergence of inflation for this year and for a little bit higher inflation the next year, but it will be compatible yet with the fact that we would have inflation within the tolerance band, whose ceiling is 6.5%. In my view, I would say that we have a risk, given this perspective that we have for domestic demand, that maybe we may breach the 6.5% target in the next year, or the 6.5 ceiling in the next year. And that's why we believe that in spite of this thing that the central bank believes that is going to be inflation, we are supposed to have a reversal of the monetary policy during the second quarter of 2013. I believe that by then, economic recovery signs are going to be much more evident than they are right now, and the inflation perspectives are going to be pointing towards a much worse scenario. So the central bank will be forced to revise its approach and therefore hike interest rates.
Gotcha. What do you think? How do you think all this will play into commodity prices or commodity demand out of Brazil? Because clearly commodity prices are a big subject for anyone in Brazil.
Yeah, commodity prices have been one of the things that people sometimes look at Brazil and say, well, Brazil is a totally commodity-driven economy. It's important to bear in mind that only 15% of our GDP is related to commodity activity-related companies or sectors. So the importance of commodities, in spite of its importance their importance for the Ibovespa, equity market, for the exchange rate, for the real side of the economy is not that important. So I would say that indirect impact coming from a declining commodity price tend to be much more important for the Brazilian economy rather than the direct impact. I don't see, and we have been seeing even this thing taking place in Brazil. In spite of this accommodation of the commodity prices, we are seeing over the foodstuff still running with a positive inflation. Again, it's something really interesting to notice if you are just counting on a deflationary contribution for those items. And therefore, I don't think that either commodities are going to play an important role in decelerating the economy very importantly, or to lead to some inflationary or to a better inflationary environment in the short term. It remains being a much more domestically driven economy. So therefore, the central bank was supposed to deal with this situation on the domestic side.
Gotcha. What is going on with the Brazil consumer these days? There was a lot of leveraging happening over the last few years, 3-4 years, and it seems recently when you look at the NPLs that we've had at some of the big banks, you know, Itaú and others, that lending activity seems to have slowed down a bit. Are Brazilians still shopping? What's going on with the Brazilian consumer these days?
I would say that the consumption has an important, will have still an important support coming from the very favorable conditions that we face in the labor market. In the labor market, the unemployment rate is coming down, and it's coming down in tandem with an increase in the level of people, or the number of people looking for jobs, which means that we are seeing an exhaustion of the labor force in Brazil, which tends to spur the wages a little bit further up. With this in mind, well, I would say, well, there is a support for the demand over there. Of course, as you mentioned, the non-performing loans have shown an increase in recent months, and basically because we start seeing a broader basis of Brazilian citizens getting access to banking accounts. Mm-hmm. We used to have very few banking clients in the past. We are now with a much larger basis of clients, something estimated around to be 9 million inhabitants having a banking account, which something used to be like a third of this some 10 years ago. Wow. So that was a tremendous increase in a short period of time, and of course, people that were not used to have credit lines, they start getting familiar with this. So it was a credit expansion, an important credit expansion that we have witnessed in the recent past. But the leverage of the households seems to have presented not that large increase. Basically because the income level has also shown an increase in the recent years. So of course, the domestic consumption tends to show a slower growth because of the minor contribution that we are going to see from this credit side, but nonetheless, I think that the income level is still going to play a very important support for the consumption. Therefore, we're still going to see the party for the Brazilian consumers going over and over for the coming years.
Makes it so unemployment stays low. Don't worry about the Brazil consumer.
I think that's true. If we start seeing some deterioration, which doesn't seem likely in the short term, and I would say the short to medium term in Brazil, we are very calm with regard to the scenario for consumption.
Gotcha.
Should we start to see some deterioration, an unexpected deterioration in the employment rate, and then this scenario could have another backdrop.
Gotcha. Real quickly, let's jump into fiscal policy a little bit. What is the government doing right, and what is the government doing wrong on the fiscal front, in your opinion?
I would say that the right thing that they are doing, they keep on pursuing the generation of a primary surplus, meaning, well, current revenues less non-financial expenditures. The wrong thing that we are doing in that sense, the generation of primary surplus has relied much more on a pattern of an increasing level of revenues rather than on the curbing of expenditures. So we keep on seeing expenditures going up, which provokes a crowding out of the private sector because more and more of the public debt needs to be rolled over. In spite of a declining trend in the net public debt, we keep on seeing the gross domestic debt is still being very important. So the rollover of these large amount of money in the gross domestic debt, it provokes this crowding out of the private sector. It is time for the Brazilian, if we would like to see a higher level of investment taking place in the country that would put us in a position of having a larger or a greater potential GDP growth, it would be time for the government to start tackling this direction, addressing a little bit more the expenditure side rather than just relying on the revenue side.
Gotcha. And then finally here, sort of to wrap it up, I wanted to touch on two topics that everyone is following and tracking these days. Worries out of Europe and worries out of China. Everyone's looking at it. Everyone's concerned about what's going on there. Does the situation concern you? And if so, how? What situations do you think are the most dangerous to Brazil? And what situations do you think don't pose much of a threat to Brazil?
I would say that it's important to bear in mind that the trade flow, sometimes people would like to say, okay, if a deceleration takes place in China or in the Eurozone, that would have an impact over the Brazilian economy because the trade flows would slow down and therefore exports would suffer a little bit. It's important to bear in mind first, well, the things that we export to Europe are basic products mostly, so I don't think that we would have a tremendous decline in the volume of exports to Europe, even in the materialization of, let's say, a less favorable scenario over there. In terms of China, soybeans and iron ore comprise the bulk of the export that we see. Therefore, if an economic deceleration takes place in Europe, I would say that the impact tends to be much more an indirect impact via the increase in the level of risk aversion that would transmit to financial concerns. So that's what really concerns me, the financial impact of an economic deceleration in Europe. With regard to China, it's important to, given this composition that I've mentioned before, in terms of iron ore and soybeans, the soybean part is not important, I would say, again, it's pretty much the same thing that I was expecting for you. The Chinese will not stop or will not reverse the soybean imports. But the iron ore, and then we have here the bulk of the exports to China, Brazilian export to China. And then it's an important thing to bear in mind. Is the deceleration expected to China going to be one that is going to lead to some slowdown also of the infrastructure investment, or is just going to be a deceleration provoked by an accommodation in the exports or in the Chinese exports? In the first case, if it's a deceleration that leads to some accommodation of infrastructure investment, then that would be important for Brazil. I don't think, at least from the recent signals that we have seen from that country, that we are going to see such deceleration taking place. And therefore, again, a deceleration in China would be much more important via its indirect effects over the Brazilian economy. Because, of course, any deceleration in the economic situation in the Chinese economy will provoke some increase in the risk aversion, and therefore the risk aversion contagion via the financial area would be something that would affect us a little bit. Will that be strong? Not that strong if we take into account that banks, Brazilian banking system, for instance, does not rely too heavily in terms of the external funding sources. We use the external funding sources in the Brazilian banking system much more to be used like subordinated debt rather than a source for funding of common operations. So that type of thing, it's limited or limits a little bit the impact, but nonetheless, of course, it would be an impact to be suffered by the Brazilian economy.
Right, understood. Listen, Jankiel, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for your time on the road with us this week. Thank you for joining us. It's been our pleasure. If you can answer any more questions, if you have any more questions for Jankiel or myself, please call me here in New York, or my colleague Joy Bahasa. We'd be more than happy to get Jankiel on the phone for you. Take care.